At 75, Kurt Russell finally reveals the truth about Val Kilmer. For years, Hollywood has been telling two completely different stories about Val Kilmer. One version painted him as a brilliant actor. The other painted him as difficult, demanding, and almost impossible to work with. But after Val's death in 2025, an old interview with Kurt Russell suddenly started making headlines again, and what Russell had to say completely challenged the narrative people thought they knew. So what was the truth about Val Kilmer? And why was one of his closest co-stars willing to defend him decades later? Before we get into what Kurt Russell said, we need to talk about what was happening behind the camera on Tombstone. The 1993 Western started with Kevin Jarre, who wrote the screenplay, set to direct. That lasted about a month before he was fired after falling badly behind schedule. A month into shooting, sets built, cast assembled, cameras rolling, and then the director is gone. The production was in full-blown crisis mode. Enter Kurt Russell. He never took a directing credit on Tombstone. George Cosmatos was brought in as the replacement. But according to Russell himself, the arrangement was unconventional. In a 2006 interview, Russell admitted he was the one pulling the strings, spending his nights drawing up shot lists and handing them to Cosmatos to execute on set. Cosmatos came in with barely 2 days of preparation. The whole thing was held together by Russell's sheer force of will. The rumors flew for years. Did Russell secretly direct Tombstone? It became one of Hollywood's great open secrets, recently finding new life on TikTok, where film history accounts break down the mystery for a new generation. The movie that came out of all that chaos was brilliant. But here is what people do not talk about as often. While Russell was holding a sinking ship together, he also had Val Kilmer on set. And Val Kilmer, at that point in his career, came with his own complicated reputation. Val Kilmer, in the early 90s, had a reputation. We are talking about full-blown Hollywood folklore. Kilmer was known for being intense, demanding, and genuinely difficult to work with. Directors had complained. Co-stars had grumbled. Studios had taken note. Stories circulated about clashes during productions and the sheer exhaustion of managing someone that deeply committed to doing things his way. By the time Tombstone came around, Val Kilmer's talent was beyond question, but his temperament was a whole other conversation. Some of it was fair. Kilmer was a Juilliard-trained actor who took his craft extremely seriously. He did not just learn his lines. He became the character, sometimes at the expense of everyone else's comfort. That level of commitment produced extraordinary results on screen. It also meant he could be mercurial, unpredictable, and genuinely difficult when the mood was not right. So when you consider that Tombstone had already lost one director, was running on fumes, and was essentially being steered by its lead actor from behind the scenes, putting Val Kilmer in the mix sounds like a recipe for disaster. You have got a movie without a real director. You have got Kurt Russell carrying the creative weight of the whole production. And you have got Val Kilmer, Hollywood's most famously difficult actor, showing up every day as Doc Holliday. What could possibly go wrong? Except it was not a disaster. Not even close. In January 2024, Kurt Russell sat down with GQ to look back at some of his most iconic roles. When the conversation turned to Tombstone, and specifically to Val Kilmer, Russell did not dance around the question. He addressed the elephant in the room head-on. Yes, he acknowledged there had been plenty said over the years about Kilmer being difficult. The reputation was out there. But then Russell flipped the script entirely. He told GQ that the two of them had a tremendously trusting relationship. Not complicated, not strained, trusting. He went further. Russell said that working with Kilmer was genuinely great. The two of them were always thinking along the same lines during filming, in sync, on the same creative wavelength. For a production as chaotic as Tombstone, that kind of alignment between the two leads was everything. And then came the moment that really made people sit up. Russell said that what Val Kilmer did with Doc Holliday was something very few actors could ever come close to touching. He called the performance brilliant, flat out. No qualifications. Now think about that. Kurt Russell has shared a screen with some of the most celebrated actors of the last 50 years. He knows what extraordinary acting looks like. When a man like that says his co-star's work was brilliant, That is not a throwaway line. That is a considered statement from someone who was in the room and watched Kilmer work every single day. And here is the detail that matters most. This was not Russell being diplomatic after a tragedy. This interview was recorded in January 2024, more than a year before Kilmer's death in April 2025. There was no grief tour, no eulogy to manage. This was just Kurt Russell, talking honestly about a man he respected, with no particular agenda other than telling the truth. But words are one thing. What about the moment that really showed the world how these two felt about each other? This is the part of the story that nobody saw coming, and it tells you more about their friendship than any interview quote ever could. What they did when Tombstone wrapped filming was so perfectly on brand it almost feels scripted. Russell explained to GQ that back in the day, it was not unusual for actors to exchange gifts at the end of a long shoot. Nobody had to do it, but it sometimes happened organically between people who had been through something difficult together. A way of saying that mattered. After Tombstone wrapped, Russell wanted to give Kilmer something that actually meant something. He arranged to get some of Kilmer's props from the film: the holster, the gun, the hat, the chair with Kilmer's name on the back. He had them photographed together into a proper keepsake. And then he added one final, gloriously dark touch. Kurt Russell bought Val Kilmer a burial plot at Boot Hill Graveyard in Tombstone, Arizona. At the actual Boot Hill, the same historic cemetery where legendary figures of the Old West are buried. Russell's reasoning was rooted in character logic. Doc Holliday was all about death. It defined him, shadowed him, gave him his fearlessness. He was a dying man with nothing left to lose, and that made him dangerous and magnetic. So what better gift for the man who played Doc Holliday than a plot in the most famous graveyard in the American West? It was funny, dark, and perfectly calibrated to the character and the friendship. But here is where it goes from funny to genuinely extraordinary. Unbeknownst to Russell, with zero coordination, Val Kilmer had also prepared a gift. And when Russell found out what it was, the symmetry of it probably stopped him cold. Val Kilmer had bought Kurt Russell an acre of land overlooking Boot Hill Graveyard. Think about that. Kilmer, who spent months playing a man defined by death and dying, gave Russell land that looks down on a cemetery, the living man's view. Russell, who played Wyatt Earp, a man defined by survival and life, gave Kilmer a place in the ground. Neither knew what the other had done. Neither planned it together. They each instinctively reached for the same symbolic contrast, death and life, completely independently. That is not a coincidence. That is two people so genuinely in sync, so deeply tuned into the same creative frequency, that they expressed their friendship in the exact same metaphor without exchanging a single word. It is one of the most quietly perfect Hollywood stories you will ever hear. This part of the story predates the GQ interview, but it is essential context. Back in 2017, Val Kilmer wrote a lengthy post on his personal blog addressing the question of who really directed Tombstone. He was not cagey about it. He just told the truth. Kurt is solely responsible for Tombstone's success, Kilmer wrote. No question. He described watching Russell sacrifice his own performance and energy to serve the film. Night after night, Russell worked on shot lists while everyone else slept. He thought about the movie as a whole while simultaneously playing one of the most iconic figures in American frontier history. Kilmer said Russell put in the kind of effort and selflessness that very few stars would ever extend in that situation. He also made an important distinction. Kilmer was clear that Cosmatos did direct the film. The credit was not fraudulent. But it was Russell's creative investment, his relentless behind-the-scenes work, his refusal to let the production collapse, that turned Tombstone into an enduring classic. Everyone cared, Kilmer wrote. But Kurt put his money where his mouth was. So here is what you have got. Two of the most acclaimed screen actors of their generation, each independently crediting the other with making one of the most beloved westerns of all time. Kilmer saying Russell saved the film. Russell saying Kilmer's performance was something few actors could ever touch. Neither statement made in the context of grief or PR management. Both made freely years apart on the record. That is the truth, which makes what happened in April 2025 all the more devastating. On April 1st, 2025, Val Kilmer passed away at the age of 65. His daughter Mercedes confirmed the news to the New York Times. The cause of death was pneumonia. Kilmer had been dealing with serious health issues for years. He was diagnosed with throat cancer in 2014, and while he eventually recovered, the treatments took an enormous toll. He underwent 2 tracheotomies, which significantly affected his ability to speak. By the time he returned in Top Gun: Maverick in 2022, the production used AI technology to recreate his voice. It was bittersweet. Kilmer back on screen in one of his signature roles, but unable to speak in his own voice. He still appeared. He still showed up. That says everything about the man. His health had been declining significantly in his final years. He had been bedridden for months. His death certificate listed pneumonia as the primary cause, with contributing factors including respiratory failure and the long-term effects of cancer treatment. The tributes came flooding in. Tom Cruise held a moment of silence at CinemaCon. Francis Ford Coppola, Cher, Jim Carrey, and countless others paid their respects. Social media filled up with clips of his greatest performances. Doc Holliday drawing down on Johnny Ringo. Jim Morrison on stage. The world was reminded just how rare a talent Val Kilmer had been. And in the days following his death, that January 2024 GQ interview resurfaced. People who had never seen it started sharing it everywhere. The clip of Russell talking about their trusting relationship, about how brilliant Kilmer had been, about the Boot Hill gifts, it spread across platforms like wildfire. Because suddenly, it was not just a career retrospective. It was a tribute. Kurt Russell, already on record, already having said everything that needed to be said, before either of them knew how little time was left. Here is what makes this story so fascinating. On paper, Kurt Russell and Val Kilmer should not have worked as well together as they did. One was a major star helping guide a troubled production. The other was an intensely dedicated actor whose reputation for being difficult had followed him for years. By all accounts, the situation seemed primed for conflict. Instead, it produced one of the most beloved westerns of all time and one of Hollywood's most enduring friendships. For more than 3 decades, both men spoke about each other with admiration. Their relationship was built on trust. Russell described them as completely in sync creatively, while Kilmer credited Russell with playing a crucial role in the film's success. Even their unusual gift exchange reflected that connection. A burial plot, an acre of land overlooking Boot Hill. Strange gifts, but deeply symbolic ones. Doc Holliday represented death. Wyatt Earp represented life. Somehow, both men understood that without needing much explanation. And that is really the point of Russell's comments. The interview was not a bombshell. It was not an exposé. It was not a dramatic confession about hidden feuds. Russell was correcting the record. He was reminding people that the popular image of Val Kilmer as simply a difficult actor never told the whole story. The Val Kilmer Russell knew was brilliant, trusted, and creatively fearless. That is the truth Kurt Russell revealed. Not a scandal, not a controversy, a friendship. And now that Val Kilmer is gone, that story may be one of the most meaningful parts of his legacy. That is the real truth about Kurt Russell and Val Kilmer. Not a rivalry or production nightmare. A genuine, deeply human connection between 2 people who understood exactly what they were making together and were grateful for every bit of it. If this one got to you, drop a comment below. What is your all-time favorite Val Kilmer performance? Doc Holliday? Iceman? Jim Morrison? Let the debate begin. And if you are not subscribed yet, now is the time. Hit that button because we cover the Hollywood stories that actually matter every single week. We will see you in the next one.